Welcome, everyone. We are called to order at 12:05 on the dot. We're going to start out with Maria Stahl, the Administrator for Florida Department of Health here in Brevard. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm sure you've all seen the latest dashboard. As of the 11 o'clock report, we've had 140 cases. We've had 5 deaths. As I say the 5 deaths, we really had 6 deaths. One of them was in one of our hospitals, but was actually an Orange County resident, so it did not get reported. It gets reported on Orange County's numbers. Currently, this morning, we have 13 COVID patients in our hospitals. We have 6 in ICU. We have 7 on just regular isolation floors, and we have 4 currently on vents. So our hospitals are actually doing very well right now. Our priorities at the health department continue to be the contact tracing for all of the cases, definitely looking at our long-term cares and our vulnerable populations and testing our first responders. As I say long-term care, some of those cases are in long-term care. I can't say which long-term cares, but some are residents, some are staff, spread out amongst several long-term care. So I just wanted to bring that forward. You've probably all heard the governor talk about the large testing sites. There are 3 large testing sites going on in our state. One's Miami, one's Orlando, and one's Jacksonville. Those 3 sites are doing a little bit more expanded testing. They are doing the asymptomatic testing for contacts, the contact cases. And our messaging continues to be the social distancing, stay at home. So that's my update. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
All right, Commissioner Smith or Isnardi on the line?
I don't have any questions.
Commissioner Smith?
No, I don't have any questions either.
Thank you so much, Maria. I appreciate you
Okay.
coming out for
Thank
the
you.
update. Thank you again. All right. As is indicated on the agenda, this meeting was called for discussion of of a recommendation from the policy group to the county commission to promote social distancing at businesses. I'm going to skip all the whereas clauses, but essentially what the policy group recommended 10-0 with all present and voting to have us do is to issue a proclamation putting forth these best practices to businesses, including the following. All employees and patrons are to practice social distancing by staying at least 6 feet apart. Group meetings, trainings, and other gatherings are to be limited to 10 persons or less. Occupancy should be limited to no more than 30% of the maximum allowable capacity under the fire code for non-residential, non-medical, and non-lodging uses. And lastly, businesses should install appropriate signage, floor markings, or other such means as may be necessary to remind customers and employees of the importance of social distancing at entry and exit points, checkout points, staging areas, and the like. Nothing in this is subject to any sort of a penalty or any sort of a punishment if they fail to do it. These are simply aspirational goals that we suggest for them so as to encourage the social distancing just as the state's doing, just as the federal government is doing. This is in keeping with that. And those that follow it will keep people safer, and those that don't certainly are encouraged to consider changing their mind and following it if and when they choose to do so. So any discussion with respect to that? Commissioner Pritchett?
Yeah, I like this one. I was able to listen in on the conversation, and
Great.
I think this is a good promotion and a good word out to our community.
Commissioner Isnardi or Smith?
No, I think it's great, and it's something that, we're not going to ask our local law enforcement to try to enforce by putting punitive stuff on it. I know a lot of these recommendations are already out there, so there's definitely no harm in getting the message out.
Okay, so if someone would make a motion, to authorize me to sign a proclamation containing those recommendations without any sort of a penalty clause or penalty provision, I'd appreciate that. All right, a motion from Commissioner Pritchett. I'll go ahead and second it. All in favor? Let's do a roll call on this one since we have a couple people on the line. All right, Commissioner Pritchett? I'll vote aye. Commissioner Tabaya? Yes. Commissioner Smith?
Aye.
And Commissioner Isnardi?
Aye.
All right, passes 5-0. Perfect. We'll move on to public comments. Jim, do we have anyone today?
We don't have any.
That's a first. All right, board reports. Do we have Mr. Bate on the line?
Yes, no report.
Ms. Bentley?
No report?
Commissioner Pritchett? Commissioner Tobias?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the humble dedication you've had over the past few weeks as role as Commission Chair and Policy Group Chair. You have been an objective voice to all media outlets during this crisis. Information has flowed transparently throughout the entire policy group. The Chair has handled this with brevity and respect for the staff and fellow commissioners' time. The Chair has been a unifying voice between the board and the policy group. This is a Herculean task. The policy group was only intended for short-term emergencies, not a situation in which the board and the group are meeting concurrently for an extended period. So, for this reason, I have a motion. I would like to make an informal motion to accept the gracious offer made by the policy group chairman, Lober, on March 27th, 2020, when you said, quote, anyone on the board that would like the chair to chair the policy group, I'd be happy to cede the reins. It's a legitimate offer, you continued. If you want to take it at some point in the future during this local state of emergency, I intend to second it as well. Under the CEMP, it would appear that vice chair would be the most sensible candidate to act as chair. I can only hope, if you continue with this, that the individual that you select will approach this with the grace and care that you have.
I'll go ahead and second it, but let me ask Ms. Bentley, just procedurally, can I simply appoint someone to serve as chair of that?
The policy group section has a specific order. If you are not the chair of the policy group, then the vice chair is next in order. Then it goes in ascending order of the districts.
So to save the motion, and if he wants to withdraw it, can I simply appoint Ms. Pritchett, Commissioner Pritchett?
Yes.
Would that be sufficient, Commissioner Tobias? Because I'm happy to do that.
And I appreciate all the work that you've done, so yes, that would be sufficient.
All right, I don't have a gavel to have it look super formal or anything, but there you are. I knight the chair of the policy group at this point. I'm sure you'll be fine. I have no doubt. All right, perfect. What else do you have, Commissioner?
One more. Thank you. Last week, the board voted to recommend the policy group that the order requiring lodgers to have a note for the employer or doctor in part due to impact on victims of domestic violence. The policy group failed to formally consider this recommendation through a vote. I reached out to several stakeholders who deal with domestic violence to get their expert input on whether, as Commissioner Lober stated, requesting the victims of domestic violence get a note from their doctor or employer before staying in a hotel is, quote, a red herring. As I suspected, the issue, unfortunately, was very real. As you can see in the emails that I'm about to pass out, certainly. But I'll just give you the excerpts.
Is this one set or two?
There's a couple
multiple.
sets by Staple. Dr. Karen Olam, the director of the Institute for Family Violence Studies at the College of Social Work at FSU, told me in their quote, requiring survivors to take an extra step of revealing their victimization to the employer is an undue burden, in my opinion. Requiring them to go to a doctor's office can involve potential exposure to COVID-19, takes health provider time away from other patients, and should not be required to obtain safe accommodations. I reached out to another one, an expert, Jennifer Dritt, the director of Florida Council Against Sexual Violence. She stated, quote, we believe that victims of domestic violence who, under the current statewide stay-at-home order, are at home with their abusers are in greater danger if they do not have access to emergency shelters at hotel. And, quote, and continues, quote, yes, I absolutely do believe requiring a doctor's note put victims at additional risk. Local governments should do everything possible to make emergency shelters for victims as accessible as possible. And finally, and I think most bluntly, Carol Wick, who's the former director of Orange County Commission on Domestic Violence and Child Abuse, former vice president of Abuse Intervention Monitoring, and Harvard educated, showed her passion for this issue and sent a detailed letter, which I've included, where she states, quote, "The bottom line is that any attempt to require them to identify themselves as survivors of domestic violence drastically increases the danger and likelihood of a subsequent homicide." So I would like to make a motion to the policy chair to inform the policy group of the recommendations that the board made with this added expert testimony.
Just a few thoughts with respect to that. First off, obviously this was not something added to the agenda. Certainly I appreciate anyone's input, especially folks that have a degree of expertise or work in a particular sector. But in the future, if you don't mind, I'm just looking as you're speaking. Some of these emails are from several days ago. If this could have been distributed in advance, it certainly would have enabled folks to look at it and then to determine if anything was perhaps lost in translation or absent context. And it's hard for me to do that with a packet that's given to me at a meeting. I can tell you no one's asked anyone to reveal their victimization to their employer. What I do know and what I can safely say is that I'm aware of at least one overflow domestic violence shelter in the county that's closed. The reason it's closed isn't because of COVID. It's closed because there isn't enough demand for them. So having spoken with colleagues of mine that work at DCF, I can tell you the folks are not being turned away. Nothing that I've heard and nothing in the brief amount of time I've had to skim this suggests anyone has been turned away that's a victim or a potential victim of domestic violence. I've spoken with law enforcement, including our sheriff. Everyone understands with respect to the orders that have been put in place that the goal isn't to punish or to hinder domestic violence victims from doing something to obtain safety. So with respect to that, I would just say if there is a recommendation that ends up being made to the policy group, talk to DCF. I would ask them what the numbers are, what the shelter situation is with respect to whether or not more people can be accommodated. I would ask if anyone to their knowledge has been turned away. Unless something's changed since I've spoken with folks, I think the answer is going to be pretty one-sided. It's great to say, well, if you love children, do this, or if you love puppies, do that, or if you love kittens, do this, or if you want to help the elderly, do this. But if you're not really helping them and all you're doing is creating a massive loophole that essentially undermines the protections that were put in place by the county commission's recommendation and by the policy group's implementation of that recommendation, I don't think it puts the county in a better spot. So, with that said, certainly if that's the direction the policy group moves, I support whatever the formal decisions are, but I would just make sure that, all the due diligence is done and that we don't do something impulsively based on information that's sprung on us at the last minute. Commissioner Pritchett?
Would it be possible if in this situation you just have someone give proof they're a Brevard County resident and therefore then you can't do it? John's telling me no. Here's a thought on this. Being a female without talking about a whole lot of stuff,
Sure.
But if you're in an abusive situation, I don't know how men handle it. One, when you're in those situations, you usually don't tell anybody. And I wouldn't go to a shelter. I probably would try to take the kids and go somewhere safe to let everything cool off for a while. And so there is a strong point with that because you just don't want to make a lot of racket over it because you don't think like everybody else thinks when you've been victimized a long time. You get protective and you try to close down and get quiet. So I think this could be something. So how do we do it to protect people that are in that situation? Because I agree, if I showed up and I had this going on, I don't feel like telling them, look, I'm about to get beat up at home or I'm going to pull out a gun and kill the guy.
Sure.
I don't want to have that conversation. And usually when you go through this, it takes a long time before you even call the police because you really feel all alone. So this really is an issue that's been brought up. So I think we're going to have to figure something out, but I don't know why a Brevard County resident in a situation, and I guess if it's legal or not, I don't understand why it's illegal. That just is illogical to me. But how do we fix this so that if you have a real situation like that, they're not having to be victimized then also by the virus?
Two things. Number one, obviously there's a degree of officer discretion, I think, and hotelier discretion that's involved. My advice to hoteliers, I had one in Rockledge reach out to me, based on the perception there were mixed messages coming between the county commission and the policy group on this particular issue. And I called Rockledge's city manager specifically about this as well. I've actually spoken with the sheriff about this as well. The advice I'm giving the hoteliers is, look, if you have a question, you're welcome to contact your local PD if you're within a municipality, or alternatively BCSO, to let them know what your concerns are. I don't think any law enforcement agency is going to interpret what we've put forth in a way that's contrary or could be contrary to the state's executive order, which I believe would specifically allow for them to stay. But again, what I would suggest, when you look at this and you look at the fact that the issue wasn't taken up, it wasn't because it wasn't discussed. It didn't make it to a vote because none of the 10, all of whom were present, made the motion because there were concerns. There were concerns from BCSO, specifically Sheriff Ivey had concerns about enforcement. He wanted his legal staff to look at this as well.
Have we heard back from him? I did
Not yet.
listen. I heard it. And he was going to come back with
Yes.
some, so I thought that was good.
I talked to him maybe an hour ago, and he wasn't ready as of an hour ago.
'Cause me, I never make good last-minute decisions. I need time to think things through. So I was kind of interested to hear if Sheriff Ivey came back with some suggestions.
Not yet, and I think it may be, there's certain problems that are beyond our ability to solve
Yeah.
as human beings, or however you want to look at it. And this is one where if there really is an issue with respect to people being turned away, and everything I've been hearing suggests there's not, if there really is an issue, I would understand the direction that the board has gone with respect to this. But I would just say, you may want to reach out to Sheriff Ivey because he's been looking at this to see where specifically he's at with it. The other thing is Jim McKnight, the city manager for Cocoa Beach, was going to have his legal staff look at this as well because they had enforcement concerns from the Cocoa Beach side, Cocoa Beach PD. I would talk to them because certainly law enforcement agencies are, if anything, going to err on the side of being protective of domestic violence victims. So if they're of a particular mind in terms of what is or isn't reasonable, that would carry a lot of weight with me. But again, it's your call in terms of how you want to approach it. I would just be very careful.
But there is no way that we can make it so that a person from Brevard County is allowed to check into a hotel in Brevard County. We can't just do that.
I would have concerns over it.
There are some concerns with that from a legal standpoint. I have been talking to the City of Cocoa Beach attorney and the sheriff's attorney, and both attorneys are trying to come up with a solution to this. I think everyone is trying to find a way to let them check in
'Cause if that would work, it solves all our
not
problems.
create a big hole in the system.
Okay.
So I've talked to both of them. They're both looking at it. Ms. Moody indicated she wanted to get samples from around the state. Good Friday,
Oh, yeah.
slow response time. So that's why there's a bit of a delay there on her end.
Okay.
I just want to.
Would you, I'm sorry,
apologize, please.
would you agree would that solve it, Commissioner Tobias, what you're thinking? If we're allowed to let Brevard County residents check into hotels?
Mr. Chair?
Please.
Ms. Bentley, I'm hesitant to ask you the possibility on, probability on finding. We have a public health director that was able to draw that direct link between, as of a couple meetings ago. Do you think you will be able to put
We're
those
in a
links of the chain
pandemic.
together?
We're in a pandemic. We haven't had one for 102 years. There's not a lot of recent case law on this topic, but it makes sense from a scientific standpoint with the testimony of our nurse, Maria Stahl. I'm sorry, Dr. Stahl, isn't she a PhD?
DNP, I think.
Yeah. So at any rate, we could possibly get some additional information from her at the policy group level to support that concept, especially for domestic violence victims, because that's another public health issue. Maybe you could tie the two together.
Mr. Chair?
Please.
Yeah, we've received a lot of flack from various elected officials who absolutely have the right to do that. Whether that is a responsible thing to do, I don't know. But what I wanted to show you here is the COVID-19 travel report that the state has issued. So I wanted to put into, this is a glaring loophole that we're talking about. the state has self-certification. The state is asking people that enter from outside to self-certify. The self-certification that Ms. Bentley was able to go through added a penalty above what the state is already doing, creating it a felony on top of a misdemeanor. So if you believe the solution, while not perfect, is not good, it's certainly one level of extra protection above that the state is providing. So to put that in perspective, here's the form. It says signature at the bottom of it. It says failure to fill out the form is a second-degree misdemeanor. If you look at the one that Ms. Bentley provided to us on here, I think it says at the bottom that it is a penalty. It's a felony here. So ours would actually be more stringent than, in fact, that of what the state is currently doing.
May I? Just a couple thoughts, and again, this is interesting to have sprung during the meeting. I wish I had the advantage of having seen this prior, since I doubt this just came up a few minutes ago, or became aware to you of, you became aware of it a few minutes ago. Looking at this, it's tough to say what enforcement mechanisms they have, but certainly the form that you've shown me here, that I've had a few seconds to glance at, would advise Florida Department of Health as to someone coming in. It looks like it would have address information, the purpose of their trip, which is something that you don't want to have locally, which would enable at least the possibility of enforcement. I think there was an article in one of the local news sources a couple days ago about the constitutionality and whether there's some statutory basis for judges to keep people absent a bond if they violate self-isolation orders, which in itself suggests that they have a mechanism of policing that and enforcing it. I offered $20 the last time that you brought this up, and no one took it up. I've got $50 right now. If you can tell me how what you propose can be realistically enforced, you can make $50 right now. I usually do the $1 bets. Here's 50.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't go to law school. I don't pretend to go to law school, and I appreciate that. I think but I would punt this. I'm sorry, and you can give that to Eden, Ms. Bentley as well, if that's the case. But I'm not a criminal defense attorney or anything. I assume that we can prove that someone perjured themselves. I hope that we can. Is there a way to prove perjury?
It's going to be just like any other situation where you've got a complaint, an investigation, and then you have to prove it. Have there been cases where someone has been found guilty of perjury in the state of Florida?
Of course.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So I'm guessing
and
that
even in this county. So
okay.
Have there been cases of which you're aware in which folks have self-certified that they're in compliance with the law where they have done so under the pain of perjury and been subsequently convicted of perjury?
I don't have one right at the tip of my fingers, but it's a matter of proof, as in all cases. The investigation will reveal the facts, and then you have to deal with it from there.
The concern that I have is, what would you investigate? Because you're not having them select a reason. You're basically having a blanket, I'm not violating the law. If someone signed that and they had a bracelet that said COVID positive on their wrist, you couldn't disprove anything they've done. If they're out on the beach, they could say, well, I'm taking a break from what I'm here to do, which is a lawful purpose. Don't worry about what it is because you have no right to ask me.
Mr. Chair, so if we were to look at the state one that has been out for quite some time, and I expect everyone to do their research. I don't, this isn't, you can file discovery with my office if you'd like. I think that is a legal term I saw on LA law or something.
We're not in a lawsuit.
It says purpose of the trip, and you select business or personal. I don't mind putting that on the form, pleasure or non-pleasure. And if they circle pleasure, then we kick them out. I have no problem with that. So my point is, the state has a less of a penalty, and it seems to be working. I want to add a penalty on top of it. Your argument is the felony doesn't work. Well, then I don't mind getting rid of the felony and just busting it down to the misdemeanor, which is sufficient to the state.
I mean, you could make it anything from literally being slapped on the wrist to being executed, and it wouldn't make a difference if it's unenforceable. That's my concern. The penalty is irrelevant if the penalty is never going to be reached. If the penalty is simply floated out there as a hypothetical that will never, in the time that it's put in place, ever be realized or even potentially realized, it doesn't matter what it is. With this, I don't have any preference over a misdemeanor set of ramifications or punishments versus felony punishments, because it just makes no difference. This is one of those where, I think we're getting to a better spot where you actually have them identify the purpose of the trip, but if they're here for business, they should have to produce something to evidence that. The same thing if they're here for medical purposes. We don't need to know what those medical purposes are, but they should have to produce something to justify that, to prove that to folks.
Again, I'm not an attorney, so I'm going to ask Ms. Bentley again. I'm sorry. I try to give you the heads up as much as possible. Can you tell me how the enforceability of the attachment A here would be any different than the enforceability of the note that is currently in place? Would you still need that investigation that you're talking about?
Same process, complaint, investigation, proof at trial.
Okay.
Ms. Bentley, just a couple questions, and I take it you have this document that was passed out only a couple minutes ago. It asks for, among other things, the driver's name, birth date, cell information, email information, residential information, license plate numbers, purpose of trip, which is what I was pushing very hard to keep, which is in this, which I do like. A question about whether or not the travel is related to providing emergency or health services, a description of the trip, length of stay, address of stay in Florida, and list all family members traveling with you, names and dates of birth. So there's a lot more to base at least a potential enforcement on with this than what we had. Are there items that are asked for in this, including some of those that I may have read off, that were not requested in what was drafted and proposed by Commissioner Tobias at our most recent county commission meeting?
There are additional items here, and we could add them. We could convert this form to apply to the situation.
I think this brings us to a better place. Commissioner Pritchett?
I'm going to make that micro. That sounds like it might not be a bad idea. The hotelers already asked for this information. They actually get your car tag and everything. So I think if we're getting to a place where we have a consideration, I think we're all trying to get to the same destination. We do not want tourists coming here right now. We're trying to just maintain our own community. So I think we're all trying to get there. It's not going to be perfect. I think what we're trying to do now is to not have any unintended consequences to where we're having another problem. So if we can come to some kind of an idea to where we're able to protect the vulnerable group in society, in our community, and still get this done, I'm listening. So I'm interested to hear what the guys out there in Cyberland have to say too. But
Commissioner Tobias, and then we'll go to Cyberland.
Thank you. And Ms. Bentley, I am sorry again, but Marcy's Law, I'm sure you're familiar with. It was Amendment 6. It had to deal with the disclosure of crimes for crime victims. Domestic violence was covered under that. What impact would that have on a self-certification as to whether or not that becomes public record, whether or not the abuser would have access to any of that, and how would you go about informing the hotelier as to whether or not that would fall within that provision or not? And I honestly don't have the answer, and that's why I'm asking you. Again, I apologize.
I would have to look at the law and check on that. Public records issues, so long as it's still held by the hotelier, it's not a public record. But once law enforcement comes and gets a copy of it, then it's a public record. So then we run into that problem. And the prior version was looking for law enforcement to be able to obtain this document from, or whatever document you end up with, from the hotels.
Ms. Bentley.
So we do have a crossover there.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that it obviously, and I agree with you 100%, that it wouldn't be record when it's maintained by a private entity like a hotel. But as to your comment that as soon as it's given to law enforcement, it becomes public record, would it not be exempt if it was given in furtherance of an investigation as to some crime during the pendency of that investigation?
It might be. It may depend on how we write it. So we need to look at all steps of this before we say it is or it isn't. We need to actually prepare the document and go through the checklist, in other words.
All right, let's go to Cyberland here. Commissioner Isnardi?
I mean, I would like to see a way that this works. I mean, it's difficult to ask local area. I would love to see it Brevard residents only if we could do it legally, but it's difficult to ask if the state's own self-certification is less punitive than what we're asking local business to do, especially if their occupancy rate is between 5 and 10% now as it is.
All right, Commissioner Smith?
I agree with Commissioner Isnardi.
Perfect. Well, you've got your work cut out for you, Commissioner Pritchett. I've got to tell you, I think you're going to have an interesting time weaving through this.
I think so too.
So anything further, Commissioner Tobias?
So let me ask this from this commission. So we're comfortable as long as we're trying to maintain victims of abuse and still maybe do the Florida one and then add the little caveat. Are you wanting to merge these two?
That sounds reasonable to me.
My one and only concern with however it works is enforceability. As long as it's enforceable, there's a very high probability I would support anything that's enforceable.
Okay, so I should check with Sheriff Ivy?
I'd appreciate it.
Okay. Am I allowed to talk to them during policy meetings by text?
Oh, Ivy?
No, you guys. No?
No,
Okay,
you'll be
just thought I'd
voting
check.
on it.
Okay.
No, unfortunately. But, I would say the other thing, I've worked with legal aid for probably the better part of a decade, representing DV victims in petitions for protection, petitions for injunctions of protection for both domestic violence and stalking. They have a lot of people, and I hate to add any more to their busy workload, but they have a lot of people that have a degree of expertise on this as well. So you could reach out to Rob Johnson over there. Pam Bress is no longer there, so unfortunately can't reach out to her, but they've got a lot of good folks too. So if you do want to talk to a different segment that has their interest at heart, you may want to give them a call.
Okay.
Commissioner Smith, what do you have, sir?
I would just like to give a shout out to all the medical people, Maria Stahl and all the folks working in the hospitals and Dr. Isnardi, because when they're in the front lines, saving lives and putting their own lives and well-being at risk, they're also separating themselves from their families. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about. But, they're not getting hugs and kisses from their loved ones. They're isolated in their own homes when they get to go home. So I just want to recognize all those folks.
Thank you, sir. All right, I've got just a couple things. I'm not going to take too much time, but I know that I've been bombarded. I imagine we've all been bombarded with folks on both sides of this issue that claim to have the answer, whatever their answer might be. Sometimes it's one extreme, other times it's the other, and generally it's very polarizing. I've come across an interesting quote that I thought really sums it up, and this is from Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's an astrophysicist, of all things, but I think it applies. And what he said was, one of the great challenges in life is knowing enough to think you're right, but not enough to know you're wrong. Did a little more recon on that to see where he came up with that. Seems rather obvious, but brilliant at the same time. There's something called the Dunning-Kruger Effect, and essentially what that is it is an explanation for the tendency of individuals who have a little bit of knowledge to think that they have a greater level of expertise as to a particular subject. So you've got your two axes. You have confidence or belief in their abilities on one side, and experience or knowledge or competence on the other side, on the other axis. And you see it peak very early on with just a little bit of competence or a little bit of experience. So I would just caution everyone, regardless of whether people are telling you what you want to hear or they're telling you the opposite of what you want to hear or a little bit of both, just be mindful of the fact that there are experts in this particular type of a crisis, whether it's health system administrators, whether it's Florida Department of Health staff, whether it's epidemiologists, whether it's immunologists. There are folks that know infinitely more than a lot of the armchair experts. So just be mindful of it. It's not to say that anyone's opinion is unimportant or irrelevant, but there are certain opinions that are appropriately expert opinions that really lay opinions shouldn't carry as much weight on, just due to the complexity and the uniqueness of the situation. Commissioner Pritchett?
You open this up for a second.
Yes, ma'am.
I think you're right on that. So I think it's always good to just take some time and to go do research and find it out. If you're going to be talking balance sheets and income statements, I've got that. But the rest of the stuff, it's a learning process to me. And so that I want all of you to know that when you guys come in with information, each of you have a heavier weight to me than the general public, because I know you're in the same arena that I am of trying to weed this out, and I know you're spending the time doing it. So I just want y'all to know, don't bring bad information, because I'm listening to you. So, but I have one quote, too, I want to read I brought today by Winston Churchill. The truth is unchangeable. Malice may attack it. Ignorance may deride it. But at the end, there it is. So I love that one.
But he's not an astrophysicist. All right. Anything further before we adjourn? Jim?
District 5.
Oh, D5. Thank you. I apologize. I didn't mean to skip you. Commissioner Isnardi?
That's okay. I would just caution not just leaders, but the public to be fully aware of all the information that's out there, because there is a lot of misinformation out there. One is that the hotels were closed when, in fact, they've never been closed. And another is that we're welcoming refugees and COVID-infected people to the county, which has never been the case. If occupancy, like I said, is down, some hotels have closed completely. In fact, many have closed completely, and occupancy is down 5 to 10%. The hotels have not been our issue as much as it has been in other areas. That's why I like the proclamation that you did. But I just want to caution people. I know everybody's afraid, but we're doing the right things. You know, the responsible populace is social distancing. We're washing our hands. We're not touching our face. We're taking care of our families. We're looking after our neighbors. And as a community, we have to keep moving forward, and we'll continue to see better results than were initially anticipated. So I just want to say thank you to the public for practicing CDC guidelines, and thank you to the commissioners for at least trying to get the truthful information out there so people aren't unnecessarily scared, but they're cautious and they're aware of their surroundings, and they're taking this seriously and reaching out to us with questions. So that's all I have.
Thank you. And I think that is a good point. I think there has been confusion as to who the hotels are letting in these days. And I think we're certainly not allowing COVID refugees in at present. I hope that we keep it that way. Last call for anything? All right, we're adjourned at 12:43. Thank y'all.
The opinions expressed by any member of the public during any period of public comment do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Board of County Commissioners of Brevard County, Florida, Space Coast Government Television, or the program sponsor, and are solely those of the presenter. The Board of County Commissioners of Brevard County, Florida, Space Coast Government Television, and the program sponsor hereby expressly disclaim any and all responsibility or liability for any defamatory or slanderous statements expressed by any member of the public during any such period.